Kyle Reeves first saw the factory when he was 6. His father had lifted him onto his shoulders in the pre-dawn dark so he could see the great beast lit up against the purple Wisconsin sky. 30,000 square feet of industrial might, its windows glowing like 1,000 eyes watching over Racine. Smokestacks exhaled white plumes that turned gold in the early light. The J.I. Case factory wasn't just a building. It was a promise. "That's where I work," his father had said, pride thickening his voice. "That's where I make the machines that build America." Kyle never forgot that moment, the way the factory had seemed both terrifying and magnificent, how his father's calloused hands had felt against his small legs, the way the morning air smelled of lake water and diesel and possibility. Now, 32 years later, on a gray April morning in 1988, Kyle's own hands were calloused, and the factory no longer seemed like a marvel. It was simply the place he reported to 5 days a week, the place that had shaped his life into predictable patterns. Up at 4:30 a.m., coffee from the same mug, lunch packed in the same metal box his father had used, the same route down Washington Avenue, the same space in the parking lot, the same locker, the same station on the tractor assembly line. The comfort of sameness, the security of knowing exactly what tomorrow would bring. Kyle's 1976 Ford F-150 rattled to a stop in his usual spot. The factory's morning shift was already humming. He could feel it in the asphalt beneath his feet, a deep vibration that had been the background radiation of his life since he was 18. 14 years now. Not as long as his father's 42, but respectable. He grabbed his lunch box from the passenger seat and walked toward the employee entrance, nodding to Daryl and Pete, who were already finishing their pre-shift cigarettes by the door. "Morning, Kyle," Daryl said, grinding his cigarette under his boot. "Ready for another day in paradise?" Kyle snorted, "Is anyone?" The ritual exchange completed, they walked through the heavy doors together. The sound hit him first. It always did, the symphony of industry that had been the soundtrack to Racine for over a century. Metal on metal, hydraulic hisses, the mechanical heartbeat of conveyor belts, voices calling over the din. Then the smells: oil, metal, paint, sweat, coffee, and something indefinable that was simply Case, a specific blend of industrial scents that clung to his clothes and skin, that his wife Caroline complained about, but that felt to Kyle like a second skin. In the locker room, he changed into his work clothes. Blue cotton work shirt with the red Case logo embroidered above the pocket, heavy canvas pants, steel-toed boots, and clipped his ID badge to his shirt pocket. The face in the small mirror inside his locker looked tired. When had the lines around his eyes deepened? When had the first strands of gray appeared in his dark hair? He was only 38 but looked older. The factory aged a man, his father used to say, aged him but gave him dignity in exchange. Was that the bargain? Kyle wondered sometimes, but not often and not for long. Out on the floor, he made his way to his station along the assembly line 4, nodding to coworkers as he passed. This section of the plant assembled the Case 2294 tractors, massive machines designed for large-scale farming operations. Kyle's job for the past 3 years had been mounting hydraulic systems, a position that required precision and experience. Before that, he'd worked in nearly every department. Welding, painting, electrical, and for a miserable 6 months, quality control, where he'd worn a tie and carried a clipboard, feeling like a traitor to the men who worked with their hands. "Morning, Reeves," said Mario Giannetti, his line supervisor, stopping by Kyle's station with his ever-present clipboard. "Got the new shipment of valves yet?" "Should be here by 10, they said." Kyle checked his tools, laying them out in the precise arrangement he preferred. Something wrong with the schedule. Mario glanced around, lowered his voice, just trying to keep ahead. "Management meeting yesterday ran long." Kyle looked up. Mario had been his friend since high school. They'd started at Case the same week, though Mario had moved up to supervision 5 years ago. "What kind of meeting?" Mario shrugged, his face carefully neutral. "Budget stuff, nothing concrete." He tapped his clipboard. "Just keep your numbers up this week, all right." Before Kyle could press further, the 7 o'clock whistle blew, and line 4 juddered to life. The first tractor chassis of the day rolled toward him, and just like that, Kyle's world narrowed to hydraulic lines and pressure valves, torque specifications, and the reassuring weight of his tools in his hands. His body knew what to do without much input from his mind, muscle memory guiding each movement. By mid-morning, Kyle's shoulders ached with the familiar tension that no amount of stretching seemed to relieve. As he finished mounting a hydraulic pump, he glanced up toward the high windows that ran along the eastern wall of the factory. Through the industrial grime, he could see patches of gray sky. April in Wisconsin, still caught between seasons, reluctant to commit to spring. During his break, Kyle joined some of the older workers at their usual table in the cafeteria. Leonard Walsh, who'd worked at Case for 37 years, was talking about his new fishing boat. "Gonna put it in the water next weekend if the weather holds," Leonard said, unwrapping a sandwich. "Got a good deal from Johnson's Marina. They're hungry for business these days." Howard Klinger, 61 and counting the months until retirement, snorted. "Everyone's hungry for business. You seen downtown lately? 3 more shops closed up last month." Kyle sipped his coffee, listening. This was a familiar conversation. Racine's economic troubles weren't new. The recession at the start of the decade had hit hard, and recovery had been slow and uneven. But Case was different. Case had always been different. "Case'll be fine," said Leonard with the confidence of a man who'd weathered previous downturns. "Farm equipment's different from cars. Farmers always need tractors." "I don't know," Howard replied, lowering his voice. "My nephew works in the office. Says international sales are down 20% from last year. Japanese competition's eating our lunch." Kyle frowned. "We've got the new models coming, though. The Magnum series is supposed to be revolutionary." "Revolutionary don't mean profitable." Howard tapped his temple. "Mark my words, something's coming. I can smell it." "You can smell your retirement party," Leonard laughed. "What are you now, 6 months out?" 5 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, Howard grinned. "Not that I'm counting." The conversation shifted to the Brewers' chances for the season, and Kyle let his thoughts wander. Howard was just being Howard. He'd been predicting doom for as long as Kyle had known him. And yet, there had been those closed-door management meetings Mario mentioned, and the parts delays that had been happening more frequently. And the fact that the last round of hiring had been frozen indefinitely. Just temporary setbacks, Kyle told himself. Case had been in Racine since 1844. The company and the city were inseparable. Hell, they called it the Case City. What was Racine without Case? What was Kyle without Case? He pushed the thought away. The brake whistle sounded, and he headed back to his station, where the real world, the world that made sense, awaited him. A world measured in torque and pressure, in completed units and quality checks. A world where a man's value was visible in the machines he helped create. That evening, Kyle pulled into the driveway of the 3-bedroom ranch house he and Caroline had bought 9 years earlier. It was a modest home in a neighborhood filled with similar houses, most occupied by other caseworkers or employees from Johnson Wax, Racine's other major employer. The American dream scaled to blue-collar specifications. He sat in the truck for a moment, watching the house. Light spilled from the kitchen window, which meant Caroline was home from her job at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Their 14-year-old son Kevin would be inside too, probably sprawled on the living room floor with homework or comics, or more likely these days, playing that Nintendo system Kyle had bought him for Christmas. Kyle felt the familiar transition happening, the factory self receding, the husband and father emerging. Different muscles, different responsibilities, different measures of success. Inside, the house smelled of pot roast and Caroline's perfume. She looked up from the stove as he entered, pushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "How was work?" she asked, the same question she'd asked nearly every weekday for 15 years. Kyle usually answered with fine or same as always, words that were both true and not true, adequate and inadequate. Today he hesitated. "Something wrong?" Caroline asked, her nurse's intuition catching the pause. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Just tired. Where's Kevin?" "At Brian's house working on their science project. I told him to be back by 7. She studied him. "You sure you're okay? You look worried." I'm fine, he said, more firmly this time. Just some talk at work about budgets and numbers, nothing new. Caroline nodded, though her eyes remained concerned. She'd grown up in Racine too, the daughter of a Johnson wax accountant. She understood the economic ecosystem of the city, the delicate balance that kept everything functioning. Mom called earlier, she said, changing the subject as she checked the pot roast. Dad's birthday dinner is still on for Sunday. Kyle nodded, grateful for the shift in conversation. I'll clean up the Chevy if Kevin wants to wash it. Make it look nice for the drive to Milwaukee. Dinner was quiet, with Kevin talking about his science project, something with batteries and light bulbs, while Kyle and Caroline listened, asking occasional questions. After dishes were done, Kyle retreated to the garage, where he was rebuilding a carburetor for his weekend car, a 1967 Chevy Impala he'd bought as a rusted shell and was slowly restoring. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where problems had clear solutions. A broken part could be fixed or replaced. Effort resulted in visible progress. There was comfort in that certainty, in the direct relationship between work and outcome. He was deep in concentration, hands black with grease, when Caroline appeared in the doorway. Phone for you, she said. It's Mario. Kyle frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. Mario rarely called him at home. Taking the kitchen phone, he heard the tension in his friend's voice immediately. Kyle, sorry to bother you at home, Mario said, his words coming fast. Have you seen the evening news? No, I've been in the garage. Why? Mario exhaled heavily. There's going to be an announcement tomorrow. Tenico is restructuring case. Corporate sent someone from their headquarters. They're meeting with plant management tonight. Tenico had acquired Case in 1970, but for the most part, they'd left the company's operations alone. Restructuring how? Kyle asked, his stomach tightening. I don't know details, but it's not good. The Magnum line is being consolidated in Fargo, and there's talk about moving more production to their European factories. Moving production from Racine, the concept seemed absurd. Case and Racine were synonymous. Look, I shouldn't be saying anything, Mario continued, his voice lower now. But you're my friend, I thought you should know before tomorrow. They're calling a plant-wide meeting at 2. After hanging up, Kyle stood in the kitchen, mind racing. Caroline watched him from the doorway. What is it? She asked. I don't know exactly, something about restructuring at Case. Mario says there's going to be an announcement tomorrow. Caroline crossed her arms, hugging herself. Layoffs. The word hung in the air between them. In manufacturing cities like Racine, layoffs were the boogeyman, the nightmare scenario that lurked at the edges of every economic downturn. I don't know, Kyle said again, hating the inadequacy of his response. Could be nothing, could be a reorganization. Your seniority would protect you, right? Caroline's voice was steady, but Kyle could see the worry in her eyes. 14 years, maybe. He tried to sound confident. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, we don't know anything yet. But that night, lying beside Caroline in the dark, sleep eluded him. He thought about his father, who had worked at Case until retirement, who had raised 3 children on a Case salary, who had defined himself by his role there. Frank Reeves had weathered economic ups and downs, had survived previous restructurings and downturns. Case always comes back, he used to say. Long as America needs to farm, Case will be here. But the America of 1988 wasn't the America of his father's generation. Manufacturing was changing. Jobs were moving overseas. Cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh were already struggling with massive industrial closures. Kyle had read the newspapers, seen the reports on the nightly news. He just hadn't believed it could happen to Case. To Racine, to him. The next morning, the mood in the plant was electric with anxiety. Rumors circulated like currents, everything from minor restructuring to complete plant closure. Kyle tried to focus on his work, but each chassis that rolled toward him seemed to carry the weight of uncertainty. At his break, he called Caroline from the pay phone near the cafeteria. I just wanted to check in, he said, watching other workers huddled in tense groups around the room. The announcement's at 2. Call me after, her voice was calm, steadying. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. Of course we will, he agreed, wishing he felt the conviction he was trying to project. It's probably nothing major. But they both knew this wasn't true. Caroline had been a nurse at All Saints Hospital long enough to see what happened when factories closed or downsized. The increase in stress-related illnesses, in depression, in domestic problems, in alcohol abuse. The ripple effects that spread through families and communities. Back at his station, Kyle worked mechanically, his mind elsewhere. He thought about his mortgage, 12 years left. Kevin's education, they'd been saving for college since he was born, but the fund wasn't nearly enough yet. The Impala in the garage, half restored, a luxury project that suddenly seemed frivolous. At 1:30, the line supervisors began shutting down the assembly lines. By 1:45, the entire factory floor, over 3,000 workers, was moving toward the main assembly hall where a stage and microphone had been set up. The massive space, usually filled with the sounds of production, was eerily quiet except for the shuffle of work boots on concrete and the occasional murmur of conversation. Kyle found himself standing between Howard Klinger and a younger worker named Dave Sullivan. Howard's face was set in grim lines. Dave kept shifting from foot to foot, nervous energy radiating from him. "My wife's pregnant," Dave whispered to Kyle, his eyes wide. "First baby due in August." Kyle nodded, unsure what to say. He'd trained Dave when he'd started at Case 2 years earlier. Good kid, hard worker. Just bought a starter home on the south side of Racine with his young wife. At precisely 2 o'clock, a group of men in suits walked onto the stage. Kyle recognized Peter Johnson, the plant manager, and several other local executives. But there were also unfamiliar faces, men with the polished look of corporate headquarters about them. One of these strangers stepped to the microphone. He introduced himself as Robert Carlson, Executive Vice President of Tenneco. He spoke about global market challenges, about competition from Japan and Europe, about the need for strategic realignment and operational efficiency. Corporate language that cloaked hard realities in bloodless terms. Then came the blow. Effective immediately, Tenneco is implementing a restructuring plan for JI Case that will include a reduction of the workforce at the Racine facility by approximately 1,000 positions over the next 6 months. 1,000 jobs. Nearly a third of the plant's workforce. A ripple of shocked voices spread through the crowd. Additionally, Carlson continued, production of the new Magnum tractor line will be consolidated at our Fargo facility, and component manufacturing for several existing lines will be transitioned to our European operations. Kyle felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. Line 4, where he worked, was being prepped for the Magnum series. If that production was moving to Fargo. Carlson continued with details about severance packages, about a phased approach to the reductions, about support services for affected employees. But Kyle barely heard him. He was calculating years of service, thinking about department seniority, wondering which production lines would be cut first. Beside him, Dave Sullivan had gone pale. Howard Klinger was shaking his head slowly, his earlier pessimism providing no satisfaction in its validation. After the announcement, workers were instructed to return to their stations for department meetings where more specific information would be provided. Kyle moved with the crowd, feeling strangely detached, as though watching himself from a distance. At the Line 4 gathering, Mario confirmed what Kyle had already guessed. With the Magnum series moving to Fargo, their line would be one of the first affected. Reductions would begin in May, barely 3 weeks away. Seniority will be the primary factor, Mario said, his voice professional but strained. Those with the least time at Case will be the first affected. Human Resources will be conducting individual meetings starting tomorrow to discuss options, including possible transfers to other departments or facilities. Kyle's eyes met Dave Sullivan's across the circle of workers. The younger man's face reflected what Kyle was feeling, a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen, not at Case, not in Racine. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. The assembly line restarted, but the rhythm was off, disrupted by the weight of what they'd learned. Men who had worked side by side for years now looked at each other differently. calculating who would stay and who would go, wondering whose position might be more secure. Kyle moved through his tasks automatically, hands doing what they had been trained to do while his mind raced ahead. 14 years at Case put him somewhere in the middle in terms of seniority. Not safe but not immediately vulnerable either, unless they cut entire departments, entire lines, which seemed increasingly likely. In the parking lot after work, he found Dave Sullivan leaning against his car, staring blankly at the factory. "You okay?" Kyle asked, knowing the answer. Dave shook his head. "2 years isn't enough seniority, I'm gone for sure." His voice cracked slightly. "What am I going to tell Angela? We just bought the house, the baby's coming." All because I told her not to worry, that Case jobs were secure. Kyle placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "Nothing's certain yet, there might be transfers available. Or maybe they'll need your skills in another department." But they both knew he was offering false hope. The cuts would be deep and swift. Tanico had made that clear. "I should have listened to my old man," Dave said bitterly. "He told me manufacturing was dying in America. Said I should go to college, get a degree in computers or something. But I wanted to work with my hands, wanted to build something real." Kyle had no answer for that. His own father had encouraged him to follow in his footsteps at Case, had pulled strings to get him hired right out of high school. It had seemed like the right path then: good pay, good benefits, the security of working for a company that had been the backbone of Racine for over a century. "Let's see what tomorrow brings," Kyle finally said. "Don't make any decisions tonight." As he drove home, the factory receded in his rearview mirror, its massive silhouette still imposing against the afternoon sky. But something had changed. The edifice that had seemed so permanent, so immutable, now revealed itself as vulnerable, as temporary. Caroline was waiting for him when he arrived home, her face tight with concern. "I saw it on the news," she said as he walked through the door. 1,000 jobs, oh Kyle." He nodded, dropping his lunch box on the counter with a dull thud. "It's bad. Line 4's one of the first affected." "Your position?" "I don't know yet. Seniority counts, but they're moving entire production lines. They're having individual meetings starting tomorrow." He leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. "Where's Kevin?" "Upstairs. He knows something's happening, but I didn't give him details." Kyle nodded gratefully. "I need to shower first, need to think about how to explain this." Under the hot water, he let the day's tension begin to dissolve. The shock was wearing off, being replaced by a complex mixture of emotions: anger at Tanico for treating workers as interchangeable parts, fear about the future. Guilt that he might survive this round of cuts while younger workers like Dave wouldn't, shame at the possibility that he might not. Mostly, he felt disoriented. Since he was 18, his identity had been wrapped up in his work at Case. It wasn't just a job, it was who he was. A Case worker like his father before him. A maker of the machines that built America. What would he be without that? After dinner, when Kevin had retreated to his room, Kyle and Caroline sat at the kitchen table, calculating, planning, preparing for possibilities. "If I do get laid off, there's unemployment benefits," Kyle said, running a hand through his hair. "And they mentioned severance, 1 week's pay for each year of service." 14 weeks, Caroline nodded. "Plus I can pick up extra shifts at the hospital. We've got some savings. We can manage for a while." Kyle looked at his wife, at the quiet determination in her face. Caroline had always been the practical one, the planner. While he had put all his eggs in the Case basket, she had insisted they save, that they live within their means, that they prepare for uncertainties. "This might not be temporary," he said quietly, voicing what they were both thinking. "These jobs might not come back." Caroline reached across the table and took his hand. "Then we'll figure out something else. You're not just a Case worker, Kyle. You're skilled, you're smart, you're good with your hands. That doesn't change because one company is downsizing." He wanted to believe her, but the identity he'd built over 14 years, over a lifetime, really was crumbling. Who was Kyle Reeves without Case? The next day at the plant was surreal. Production continued, but the heart had gone out of it. Workers moved through their tasks mechanically while supervisors huddled in tense conversations. Throughout the day, people were called to human resources for individual meetings, returning with faces that told the story before they spoke. Laid off, transferred, or temporarily reprieved, Kyle's meeting was scheduled for 2:30. He sat across from a woman he'd never met before, a HR representative from corporate, and Mario, whose face was locked in a professional mask. "Mr. Reeves," the woman began, consulting a file. "You've been with Case for 14 years, correct?" "Yes," Kyle answered. "Started in '74, right out of high school." She nodded, making a note. "Your performance evaluations have been consistently excellent, and you have specialized training in hydraulic systems." "That's right. Unfortunately, as you know, Line 4 is being phased out as the Magnum production moves to Fargo." She paused, and Kyle felt his stomach tighten. "However, your experience with hydraulics is valuable. We're offering you a position in the testing department for the remaining tractor lines." Relief washed over him, quickly followed by guilt. Others wouldn't be so lucky. "The position comes with a 10% reduction in pay," she continued, sliding a document across the desk. "And it should be understood that this is not a guarantee against future reductions should they become necessary. 10% less pay for the privilege of keeping his job. And no guarantees for the future." Kyle nodded slowly. "What about transfers to Fargo for those being laid off?" "There are a limited number of positions available," the woman replied. "Those with specialized skills are being considered first." "Like Dave Sullivan from my line," Kyle said. "He's one of our best hydraulic fitters, only 2 years in, but he picks things up fast." Mario gave him a warning look, but Kyle pressed on. "He's got a baby on the way, a new house." The woman made another note, her face impassive. "We'll review all personnel files carefully, Mr. Reeves. Now, regarding your position, if you'll sign here." Kyle signed the document, accepting the pay cut, accepting the uncertainty, accepting that everything had changed. As he left the office, he saw Dave Sullivan waiting for his turn, his face tense with anticipation. "Put in a good word for you," Kyle said quietly as he passed. "Mentioned your hydraulics expertise." Dave nodded gratefully, though they both knew it might not make a difference. The decisions were being made by people who saw workers as numbers on a spreadsheet, not as men with families and mortgages and dreams. That Friday, the first round of layoff notices was distributed. Dave Sullivan was among them, along with nearly 200 others, mostly younger workers with less seniority. The mood in the plant was funeral-like, with those who had survived this round watching guiltily as their colleagues cleared out lockers, said awkward goodbyes, and walked out of the factory doors, some for the last time. Kyle found Dave in the locker room, methodically emptying the metal cabinet he'd been assigned 2 years earlier. "I'm sorry," Kyle said, inadequately. Dave nodded, not looking up. "Not your fault." He folded a sweatshirt, placed it in a cardboard box. "They offered me a transfer to Fargo, 10,000 less a year, and we'd have to sell the house, move away from both our families." "Are you going to take it?" Dave shrugged. "What choice do I have? Angela can't work with the baby coming. Her job at the dental office doesn't have benefits." He finally looked at Kyle, his eyes red-rimmed. "This was supposed to be a career, you know. My dad worked at American Motors for 34 years before they closed. I thought Case would be different." Kyle had no answer. He'd thought the same thing. The next few weeks brought a strange new reality to Racine. The local newspaper ran daily stories about the Case layoffs, about the economic impact on the community, about emergency meetings of the city council to discuss response strategies. Downtown businesses put up brave faces, but the fear was palpable. Case workers spent money in those stores and restaurants. Case workers bought houses and cars. Case workers were the economic engine of Racine. At home, Kyle and Caroline adjusted their budget to account for his reduced salary. No more dinners out. No more contributions to Kevin's college fund for now. The Impala restoration project was put on indefinite hold. "We're the lucky ones," Caroline reminded him when he apologized for these cutbacks. "We still have 2 incomes. We can make this work." But Kyle saw the strain in her eyes, the way she studied grocery store advertisements more carefully now, the way she had started picking up extra shifts at the hospital. And he felt the subtle shift in their marriage, the balance of financial security tilting away from him. The provider role he had always assumed was his becoming shared, uncertain. On Saturdays, he started driving around Racine, looking for now hiring signs, picking up applications, researching other manufacturers in the region. Most were also downsizing. Some had closed entirely. The few that were hiring offered wages far below what Case paid, with fewer benefits and less security. "Maybe I need to learn something new," he told Caroline one night as they sat on the porch, watching the spring evening settle over their neighborhood. "Go back to school or something." "For what?" she asked, practical as always. "I don't know, computers maybe, electronics," he sighed. Dave Sullivan's dad told him manufacturing was dying. Maybe he was right. Caroline was quiet for a moment. "My hospital's expanding their maintenance department. They need people who understand mechanical systems, electrical work. It wouldn't be the same money as Case, at least not at first, but it's stable. Healthcare isn't going anywhere." Kyle nodded, but the thought of leaving manufacturing, of leaving the world he understood, filled him with a vague dread. Hospital maintenance meant fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells, meant fixing air conditioning units and calibrating medical equipment. It wasn't building tractors that would till American soil. It wasn't being part of something that stretched back to the 19th century, that was woven into the fabric of Racine itself. May turned to June, and the layoffs continued. Each week brought new notices, new faces saying goodbye, new empty spaces on the factory floor. Kyle's position in testing seemed secure for now, but the uncertainty hung over everything like a toxic cloud. Downtown Racine began to show the strain. A furniture store that had been on Main Street for 40 years closed its doors. A family restaurant reduced its hours. 4 lease signs appeared in previously occupied storefronts. The economic ripples spread outward from the Case factory, touching every aspect of city life. In their neighborhood, 2 houses went up for sale as Case workers sought employment elsewhere or downsized to accommodate reduced circumstances. Dave Sullivan and his pregnant wife sold their new home at a loss and moved to Fargo, reluctantly accepting the transfer rather than facing unemployment. At Kevin's middle school graduation in June, Kyle sat in the auditorium watching his son accept his certificate, tall and gangly at 14, caught in that awkward phase between child and teenager. He felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by anxiety. What kind of future would Kevin have? Would there be good manufacturing jobs when he graduated high school? Should Kyle encourage him toward college, toward a different path than the one he and his father had followed? The thought made him sad in a way he couldn't quite articulate. There had been dignity in what they did, he and his father. They had built things that mattered. They had been part of a tradition, a continuum. The idea that this might not be an option for his son felt like a loss, a breaking of something essential. After the ceremony, as families clustered in proud groups around their graduates, Kyle ran into Bill Jensen, whose son was in Kevin's class. Bill worked at Johnson Wax, Racine's other major employer. "Heard about Case," Bill said, shaking Kyle's hand. "Tough break for the city." Kyle nodded. "We're hanging in there. I kept my job, at least for now, took a pay cut, but—" He trailed off, not wanting to seem ungrateful when others had lost everything. Bill glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Word is Johnson's watching closely. They've been talking about moving some production to their Mexico facilities for years. Case situation might push them to finally do it." A chill ran through Kyle. If Johnson Wax started cutting jobs too, Racine would be devastated. The city's 2 industrial pillars crumbling simultaneously. "Let's hope not," Kyle said. "City can't handle another hit like this." Bill nodded grimly. "My brother-in-law's in real estate. Says the housing market's already tanking. Case workers trying to sell, no one buying because everyone's worried about their own jobs." On the drive home, Kyle found himself taking a detour past the Case factory. Even on a Saturday, it would normally have been partially operational, with weekend shifts keeping certain production lines running. Now the parking lot was nearly empty, the building silent, the smokestacks cold. He pulled over and sat in his truck, staring at the factory where he'd spent his entire adult life. The factory his father had shown him as a child, glowing against the dawn sky. It was still an impressive structure, still dominated the Racine skyline, but now it seemed diminished somehow, less permanent, less certain. What had his father said? "That's where I make the machines that build America." But America was changing. The world was changing. Manufacturing was moving overseas to places where labor was cheaper, regulations fewer. The certainties Kyle had built his life around were dissolving before his eyes. July brought more layoffs, another round of grim-faced workers clearing out lockers. The testing department where Kyle now worked was reduced by half. His position remained, but the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Those who still had jobs worked with a desperate intensity, as if their productivity might save them from the next round of cuts. Those whose friends and family members had been laid off carried a weight of survivor's guilt. One Thursday, as Kyle was finishing his shift, Mario appeared at his workstation. "Got a minute?" his friend asked, gesturing toward a quiet corner. Kyle followed, noting the tension in Mario's shoulders. "What's up?" "They're announcing another reorganization tomorrow," Mario said quietly. "Testing is being consolidated. Half the remaining positions are being eliminated." Kyle felt the now familiar clench of anxiety. "My position." Mario hesitated. "I don't know for sure. But they're prioritizing those with the most specialized skills." He paused. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Johnson Memorial Hospital called HR yesterday asking about you specifically. Apparently Caroline mentioned to someone in administration that you might be interested in a maintenance position." Kyle stared at his friend, surprised and slightly embarrassed. He hadn't applied for any hospital jobs. Caroline must have taken the initiative without telling him. "Thanks for the heads up," he said finally, "about both things." Mario nodded. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Kyle, don't wait too long to make decisions. The good jobs that are left in Racine are going to be snapped up fast." That night, Kyle confronted Caroline about the hospital job. "You should have told me you were putting my name out there," he said, trying to keep the irritation from his voice. Caroline looked up from the bills she was sorting at the kitchen table. "I just mentioned to Linda in administration that you might be available soon. She said they're having trouble finding qualified maintenance personnel." She studied his face. "Are you angry?" "Not angry. Just," he sighed, sitting down across from her. "I'm still employed at Case. I've been there 14 years. It feels like you're giving up on that." "I'm being realistic," Caroline replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You said yourself that more cuts are coming. I'm trying to create options for us, Kyle, for this family." He knew she was right, but something in him rebelled against the pragmatism of it. Leaving Case felt like surrender, like betrayal. Of what exactly he wasn't sure. His father's memory, his own identity, the city itself. "Mario says there's another round of cuts coming tomorrow," he admitted. "Testing department is being consolidated." Caroline's face showed no surprise, only resignation. "Your position?" "He doesn't know for sure, but it's not looking good." She reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Like we always do." The next morning, Kyle dressed for work with unusual care, as if the right shirt or the precise fold of his collar might somehow protect him from what was coming. In the bathroom mirror, he studied his reflection, the deepening lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples, the set of his jaw that reminded him more and more of his father. Frank Reeves had died 3 years earlier, retired and content after 4 decades at Case. Kyle was grateful his father hadn't lived to see the company's contraction, the breaking of the implicit promise that had defined their working lives. At the plant, the announcement came via department meetings rather than a plant-wide gathering. Testing was indeed being consolidated, with operations moving primarily to the Fargo facility. Of the 30 positions currently in Racine's testing department, only 8 would remain. Kyle's name was not on the list of those keeping their jobs. The HR representative, a different one this time but with the same detached professionalism, explained the severance package. 14 weeks of pay, extended health benefits for 3 months, job placement assistance. She handed him a folder of paperwork and a plastic bag for his personal items. "You can clean out your locker now or come back on Monday if you prefer," she said, already glancing at her list for the next employee interview. Kyle chose to do it immediately, not wanting to prolong the process. In the locker room, he methodically emptied the small metal cabinet that had housed his personal items for 14 years. Work gloves his wife had given him for Christmas. A spare set of steel-toed boots. Photos taped to the inside of the door. Kevin as a toddler sitting on a case tractor at a company picnic. Caroline on their 10th anniversary. His father in his case uniform, proudly standing beside a just-completed tractor. He removed the photos carefully, sliding them into the envelope of paperwork. From other corners of the locker room came the sounds of men in the same position, locker doors closing with finality, murmured conversations, a few choked sobs quickly stifled. Kyle was surprised by how calm he felt. The anticipation had been worse than the reality. Now that it had happened, now that he was officially no longer a case employee, a strange clarity descended. The future was uncertain, yes. Frightening even, but the limbo of the past few months was over. Now at least he knew where he stood. In the parking lot, he placed the bag of personal items on the passenger seat of his truck and sat for a moment, looking at the factory. He'd arrived here as a teenager, following in his father's footsteps, certain of his place in the order of things. He left as a middle-aged man, unsure of what came next but somehow lighter for the uncertainty. 14 years. Not as many as his father's 42, but still, a significant portion of his life, given to this place, to these machines, to this company that had now decided it could continue without him. As he drove away, he found himself thinking not about the loss but about the possibilities. Hospital maintenance, maybe, or perhaps something entirely different. The world was changing. Maybe it was time he changed too. At home, Caroline was waiting, having taken the day off in anticipation of the announcement. Her face told him she already knew. "Mario called," she explained. "I'm so sorry, Kyle." He set down the bag of locker items and pulled her into an embrace. "It's okay," he said, surprised to find he meant it. "Really, it's okay." Over the next weeks, Racine adjusted to its new reality. The case workforce, once over 3,500 strong, had been reduced to just over 2,000. The local economy staggered under the impact. Housing prices fell, retail businesses struggled, tax revenue declined. The city government announced budget cuts, including reductions in police and fire services. Schools postponed planned renovations. Parks went unmaintained. The laid-off case workers scattered, some, like Dave Sullivan, accepting transfers to other facilities, others finding jobs locally at reduced wages. Some returning to school to learn new skills, a few leaving Racine entirely for opportunities elsewhere. Kyle interviewed at Johnson Memorial Hospital and was offered a position in their maintenance department. The pay was indeed lower than what he'd made at Case, even after his pay cut, but the benefits were good and the job security seemed solid. Healthcare, as Caroline had pointed out, wasn't going anywhere. His first day at the hospital was disorienting. After 14 years of factory noise, the relative quiet of hospital corridors seemed almost eerie. Instead of the smells of oil and metal, there was the antiseptic scent of cleaning products and the faint underlying notes of illness and treatment. Instead of the rhythmic certainty of the assembly line, there was the unpredictable flow of maintenance requests. A broken air conditioner in pediatrics, a malfunctioning automatic door in the ER, a faulty electrical outlet in a patient room. But the work itself was satisfying in ways Kyle hadn't expected. His mechanical skills transferred well to the hospital environment. The equipment might be different, but the principles of troubleshooting, repair, and maintenance were similar. And there was something immediately rewarding about fixing problems that directly affected patient care. When he repaired the air conditioning in pediatrics, the grateful smiles of nurses and parents made him feel useful in a new way. At home, the adjustments continued. The reduced income meant continued budget tightening. Kevin got a part-time job at the grocery store to earn his own spending money. Caroline picked up an extra shift each week. They rented out their camping trailer, which had been sitting unused in the driveway. Small sacrifices, but they added up. One Saturday in September, Kyle was in the garage, working on the Impala for the first time since the layoff. With his severance package, they'd been able to maintain their mortgage payments, and things were stabilizing financially. It felt good to return to the project, to lose himself in the methodical work of restoration. He was deep under the hood when he heard a car pull into the driveway. Moments later, Mario appeared in the garage doorway. "Thought I'd find you out here," his friend said. "Car's looking good." Kyle wiped his hands on a rag. "Getting there. How's it going at the plant?" Mario's face clouded. "Not great. They're moving more production to Europe next month. The Fargo transfer isn't working out like they planned, quality issues." He shook his head. "Rumor is they're going to close the Racine plant completely within 2 years. Move everything to their new facility in Mexico." Kyle absorbed this news quietly. He'd been hearing similar rumors around town, but having it confirmed by someone still inside made it more real. Case leaving Racine entirely, it was almost unimaginable. The company and the city had grown together, shaped each other. Case tractors had been built in Racine since before the Civil War. "What will you do?" Kyle asked. Mario shrugged. "They've offered me a position at the corporate office in Illinois. It means moving, but what choice do I have? Manufacturing jobs aren't coming back, not here." He studied Kyle. "How's the hospital working out?" "It's different," Kyle admitted. "Quieter, more unpredictable, but I like it, actually. The work matters in a direct way." "You always were good at fixing things," Mario nodded. "Better than most of us." He hesitated. "I miss it, though, the plant, the guys, making things that matter." "I know," Kyle said softly. "Me too." After Mario left, Kyle returned to the Impala, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. His friend's news had unsettled him, bringing back the sense of loss he'd been working to move beyond. He put away his tools and went inside. Caroline was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Kevin was at the table, textbooks spread around him, high school freshman now, studying with an intensity Kyle hadn't shown at that age. "Mario stopped by," Kyle said, washing his hands at the sink. "Says the rumors are true. Case is likely closing the entire Racine plant within 2 years." Caroline paused in her cooking, absorbing the news. "That will devastate the city." "I know," Kyle dried his hands, leaning against the counter. "Makes me wonder if we should consider moving too, before property values crash completely." Kevin looked up from his homework, alarmed. "Move, leave Racine." Kyle and Caroline exchanged glances. They hadn't discussed this possibility seriously, at least not in front of their son. "It's just an idea," Caroline said gently. "Nothing's decided." "But all my friends are here," Kevin protested. "My school. The basketball team." "We're not planning anything right now," Kyle assured him. "But things are changing in Racine. We need to be realistic about what that might mean for us." Kevin returned to his homework, but his face remained troubled. Kyle felt a pang of guilt. His son was at an age where stability mattered, where friendships and school connections were everything. The idea of uprooting him seemed cruel. But what if staying meant watching their property value collapse, their neighborhood decline, their city slowly wither? That night after Kevin had gone to bed, Kyle and Caroline sat at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee between them. "Do you really want to leave?" Caroline asked. "Your family's been in Racine for generations." Kyle considered the question. His grandparents had moved to Racine in the 1920s, drawn by Case jobs. His father had been born here, had lived his entire life within 5 miles of the factory. Kyle himself had never seriously considered living anywhere else. "I don't know," he admitted, "but if Case goes completely, what happens to Racine? Johnson Wax can't support the whole city, and if they start moving jobs out too," he trailed off, the implications clear. "The hospital will still be here," Caroline pointed out. "Healthcare jobs aren't going anywhere. And my parents are here. your sister and her family. I know, Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. It just feels like everything's shifting under our feet, like all the certainties are gone. Caroline reached across the table and took his hand. Maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe we needed to be shaken up a little. Kyle looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, she said carefully, that maybe there was something limiting about the way we saw our future, the way this city saw its future. Everything tied to one company, one industry. Maybe there's something else Racine could be, something else we could be. Kyle thought about this. It was true that Racine's identity had been bound up with Case for so long that it was hard to imagine the city without the company. Just as it had been hard for him to imagine his own life without his Case job. But here he was, adapting, finding new ways to use his skills, discovering aspects of himself that might have remained dormant if he'd stayed at the factory until retirement. Maybe you're right, he said slowly, but it's hard to let go of what you've always known. I'm not saying we should move, Caroline clarified, just that we shouldn't be afraid of change. That we should see it as an opportunity, not just a loss. In the weeks that followed, Kyle found himself looking at Racine with new eyes. The city was undeniably struggling, more businesses closing downtown, more houses with for sale signs, more families leaving for opportunities elsewhere. But there were also signs of adaptation, of resilience. A former manufacturing space converted into artist studios, a new healthcare training center opened by the technical college. Small tech companies moving into renovated industrial buildings, attracted by lower costs than Chicago or Milwaukee. The city was changing, painful as it was. And perhaps Caroline was right, perhaps that change, while difficult, wasn't entirely bad. At the hospital, Kyle's work expanded beyond basic maintenance. His mechanical skills and problem-solving abilities had been noticed, and he was given more complex projects. Designing and implementing a more efficient heating system for the new pediatric wing, developing a preventative maintenance program for critical equipment, training younger staff members in basic repairs. The work was different from building tractors, yes, but it was satisfying in its own way. And there was something to be said for knowing his efforts directly improved patient care, made the hospital function better, helped his community in tangible ways. One chilly October evening, he found himself driving past the Case factory again. The facility was still operating, but at a much reduced capacity. Fewer lights burned in the windows. Fewer cars filled the parking lot. The great smokestacks, which had once billowed continuously, now stood mostly silent. Kyle parked across the street, in the same spot where his father had lifted him onto his shoulders all those years ago to see the factory against the dawn sky. In the gathering dusk, the building looked smaller somehow, less imposing, less eternal. He thought about his father, about the certainty with which Frank Reeves had approached his life at Case. The pride he had taken in his work, in his role as a maker of the machines that built America. What would he make of these changes? Of the shifting economic landscape that had rendered his life's work somehow obsolete? Kyle didn't know. But he hoped his father would understand that adaptation wasn't betrayal. That finding new paths wasn't abandoning the values he'd been raised with: hard work, craftsmanship, responsibility, community. Those remained even as the context changed. As he drove home, Kyle realized he no longer felt the acute sense of loss that had dominated his emotions in the months following his layoff. The grief was still there, but it had mellowed into something more complex, more nuanced. Sadness for what was passing away, yes. But also hope for what might be emerging. Gratitude for the skills and values his years at Case had given him, and a growing confidence in his ability to apply those in new contexts, to navigate the changes that were reshaping Racine and reshaping his own life. Case might be leaving, manufacturing might be declining, the certainties of previous generations might be dissolving, but the essence of what made Racine and what made Kyle Reeves remained. Changed, challenged, adapting, but enduring nonetheless. When he pulled into his driveway, the house was lit up against the early autumn darkness, warm and inviting. Through the window, he could see Caroline at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner. Kevin at the table, books spread around him. the familiar shapes of his life continuing, even as the larger context shifted. Kyle turned off the engine and sat for a moment, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. The future was uncertain, yes, but maybe that uncertainty wasn't something to fear. Maybe it was simply the space in which new possibilities could emerge for himself, for his family, for his city. With that thought in mind, he got out of the truck and walked toward his home, ready to embrace whatever came next.